So my talk today bears as a title, Nature and Culture in Visual Communication, Japanese Variations on Ludus Naturae, the caprice of nature or the playfulness of nature. Visual communication can be defined in different ways. An effective one is through opposition with signification. Whereas visual signification can be unintentional, there is no communication without intentionality. A sunset signifies something, whereas a painting signifies something but also communicates, because culture marks it as a product of communicative intentionality. However, imputation of intentionality changes across cultures and epochs. Whereas religion may see sunset as divine message, secular observers will attach to it an unintentional meaning of nostalgia. A strong model of communicative intentionality predominates in Western visual history. There is visual communication if and only if human intentionality plans to communicate with a spectator through a visual artifact. Yet, this strong model includes exceptions of different kinds. Akeiropoietai images, that is, images that are believed not to have been made by human hand, like the Holy Shroud in Turin, my city. Natural images, casual images, and pareidolia. On the definition of pareidolia, I will say something later. In these cases, an image that does not properly result from human intentionality is conceived nonetheless as visual communication. Hence, attribution of intentionality implies the anthropomorphization of various non-human agents, respectively transcendence, nature, chance, an imaginary and non-identified agent. Agency in visual communication is a key theme for art theory, visual anthropology, and visual semiotics. Scholars have long questioned how human beings single out images, how they attribute meaning to them, how they consider them as message from another intentionality, how images signify and communicate beyond their creator's intentionality, and how their perception leads to pragmatic effects in the world. Neurophysiological and cognitive research suggests that human beings are hardwired to recognize meaningful visual patterns in reality and to believe that they result from intentional agency. The exceptions listed above, and especially pareidolia, confirm this view. Neurophysiology so compels human beings to recognize communicative images that they sometimes identify them, although these images do not result from any intentionality. This biological instinct, however, is shaped and sometimes even repressed by culture. The power of images is not a given, but a range that varies through history and cultures. Some visual cultures emphasize the intentionality of artists and image creators. Other cultures accentuate that of spectators, and other cultures yet underline the intentionality of visual artworks and artifacts themselves. Whereas nature pushes human beings to recognize images and their makers in the world, such adaptive biological attitude is affected by visual cultures. In some contexts, human beings react to an image by looking for its creator. In some other contexts, they disregard the intentionality of the creator and focus on the way they themselves create the image and the reception of it. And in some other contexts yet, they concentrate on how the image itself becomes a communicative agent in the world. One of the first authors to hint at the possibility of non-human-made communicative images is Pliny the Elder, the encyclopedic author of the natural history, Naturalis Historia. I always joke with my students, I say that Pliny the Elder is like the Wikipedia of antiquity. In book 36 of his monumental work, Pliny expounds on the variety of Greek marbles. He dwells on that which is found in the Isle of Paros and relates an extraordinary event. Once a block was split into halves and the figure of Silenus made its appearance. Pliny does not disclose who the author of this image might have been, but implicitly admits that nature is able to produce complex images in all similar to those created by human beings. In book 37 of the Natural History, bearing on precious stones, Pliny returns on the subject. He recalls that the king Pyrrhus possessed an agate upon which the 9 Muses and Apollo holding a lyre were to be seen. According to Pliny, that was, I quote, not a work of art, but the spontaneous produce of nature, the veins in it being so arranged that each of the Muses had her own peculiar attribute, end of quote. Again, the encyclopedic author suggests that complex visual representations spontaneously emerge in nature as though nature had the same creative capacity of a sculptor or a painter. Artists are able to imitate nature, but Pliny implies nature too is able to imitate art in producing natural images of human bodies. The tradition of recognizing meaningful visual patterns in minerals is long. Most of it bears on divination, that is, the belief that a transcendent agent communicates to human beings through peculiarly shaped stones. The tradition often goes under the name of talismanic sculpture, as the French theologian and Christian Kabbalist Jacques Gaffarel denominated in his 1629 treatise in order to defend it from the Orientalist accusations of French rationalists. In Pliny's case, though, nature is not a message from the gods, but the messenger itself, which creates artistic forms within itself with no other purpose than beauty. The latter is a cross-cultural tradition witnessing to the cognitive mechanisms of visual pattern recognition. Italian decorative stones include the so-called paesine, in English ruin marbles. They are extracted almost exclusively in the province of Florence. Their particular morphological and chromatic configuration seems to represent natural or urban landscapes. Figure 1 reproduces a paesina found on the Tuscan Apennine mountain, which gives the impression of depicting an arid mountainous landscape like a U.S. canyon. When human beings see this image, it is virtually impossible for them not to recognize a landscape in it, as if the mountain had produced a self-portrait of itself in one of its stones. Paesine have been rare collectibles at least since the 15th century. The Medici family had a collection of them, as well as the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, Philip II, Duke of Pomerania, Gustav II Adolf, King of Sweden, and other early modern aristocrats. Paesine inspired not only collectors but also artists. The 17th century Dutch painter Mathieu Dubus executed a view of Sodom and Gomorrah, currently in a private collection at The Hague, simulating a paesina in the background. In this vertiginous mise en abîme, the painter imitates nature that imitates a painter that imitates nature. In the 20th century, surrealist artists such as André Breton or the architect Fernand Pouillon took an interest in these uncanny stones. Paesine stones inspired poets as well. Roger Caillois himself devoted verses to them. Chilean Nobel laureate Pablo Neruda wrote the most famous poem about these peculiar stones upon his 1951 visit to Florence. In La Ciudad, contained in the collection of poems entitled Las uvas y el viento, The Grapes and the Wind, Neruda wrote, "Orange stains of oxide, green veins on the calcareous piece, that foam mints with its wrenches or dawn with its rose. Thus are these stones. Nobody knows whether they emerged from the sea or to the sea return. Something caught them while they were alive. They expired in immobility and built a dead city. A city without cries, without kitchens, a solemn enclosure of purity, pure forms fallen in a disorder without resurrection, in a multitude that lost its gaze, in a grey monastery condemned to the naked truth of its gods." As a consequence of the cognitive instinct that pushes human beings to identify intentional iconic messages in chaotic visual environments, stones encourage fantasy cross-culturally. In no culture, this instinct has given rise to more refined reverie than in the Japanese one. Another Nobel laureate, Yasunari Kawabata, referred to the Japanese art of landscape stones in Japan, the Beautiful and Myself, the speech that he read upon receiving the Nobel Prize on December the 12th, 1968. He said, I quote, "Nothing is more complicated, varied, attentive to detail than the Japanese art of landscape gardening. Thus, there is the form called the dry landscape, composed entirely of rocks, in which the arrangement of stones gives expression to mountains and rivers that are not present, and even suggests the waves of the great ocean breaking in upon cliffs. Compressed to the ultimate, the Japanese garden becomes the bonsai dwarf garden, or the bonseki, its dry version." Suseki, an abbreviation of the term Sansui Keiseki, which approximately translates as landscape view stone or landscape scenery stone, is a cornerstone of traditional Japanese aesthetics. It was adopted from China through Korea. In China, imaginative stones are still called gonshi or guaishi, fantastic or strange stones, or also shangsek. In Korea, they are presently known as useok, eternal stones. In Japan, the tradition of recognizing images in stones was increasingly perfected and articulated, gaining peculiar characteristics. Beginning in the Muromachi period, particularly in the Nambuko-cho period era, 1336-1392, it flourished under Emperor Go-Daigo, who was an avid collector of imaginative stones and became popular in the late Edo and early Meiji periods. In Japan, too, imaginative stones have inspired both poets and painters. The scholar, poet, and painter Rai Sanyo must have contemplated at length a stone in his possession, which tradition entitles Li Po meditating on a waterfall. Originally found in China on Mount Lu Shan in the Fujian province, it was likely brought to Japan in 1654. The black and white reproduction allows one to appreciate the chromatic, color, eidetic, shape, and topological position elements, encouraging the gaze to recognize in the stone a human figure placidly sitting on a rock. The attribution of a verbal title reinforces the visual identification and adds details to it. The Petrified Man is the great Chinese poet Li Po, engrossed in meditation before a waterfall. The bottom part of the stone represents itself in a sublimated version as pedestal for spiritual meditation and poetic musing. It is no wonder that this stone, might have appealed to Rai Sanyo, who is remembered as one of the finest Kanshi poets of his time. In contemplating the stone, he must have beheld a sort of petrified, immobile version of his ideal role model in a mise-en-abîme wherein a poet would ponder the stony effigy of another poet who was in turn meditating while sitting on a rock. The pragmatic effect of the fractal contemplation must have been enhanced by the unfinished quality of the stone, by its infinite and impalpable mutability under light and gaze. Digression into a delicate page in the history of Suseki should encourage appreciation of cross-cultural and trans-historical sensibility. The Paesine of Florence inspired the poetry of Pablo Neruda in the 20th century. As a fine specimen of Japanese Suseki must have stirred Rai Sanyo's imagination in the early 19th century. Imaginative stones offer visual clues that human cognition is compelled, almost constrained, to complete through identification of a represented subject and apposition of a name. But differences in the cultural reception of this common cognitive principle should not be neglected. First, whereas imaginative stones became a proper aesthetic genre in China, Korea, and especially Japan, they were mostly a mere curiosity in the Western artistic tradition that resulted in discrepant levels of specificity in articulation. Today, the Nippon Suseki Association officially distinguishes between Toyama Ishi, that is, stones representing distant mountains, Shimagata Ishi, having island-like forms, Iwagata Ishi, resembling seaside cliffs, Tamara Ishi, or water pool stones, Taki Ishi, representing waterfalls, Doha, containing the figure of an open plain, Danseki, including the figure of a stepped or terraced plain, Katsuya Ishi, having the form of old cottages, Sugata Ishi, resembling humans, saints, or animals, Monyoseki, with specific surface patterns, subdivided into Baikaseki and Kikaseki. This is just the beginning of the articulation, which is very maniacal. For the sake of pursuing the parallel inquiry into the history and aesthetics of imaginative stones in the East and in the West, it should be mentioned that 16th century Italian naturalist Ulisse Aldrovandi attempted an analogous classification. The founder of Bologna's Botanical Garden and a pioneer of European natural history, according to both Linnaeus and the Comte de Buffon, Ulisse Aldrovandi was also an encyclopedic collector of curiosity. In 1648, he published the Museum Metallicum in Libros Quatuor, literally the Metallic Museum, a monumental work of 1,000 pages divided into 4 sections, in which he listed, categorized, and described material and symbolical characteristics of all minerals known at that time. The concept of natura ludens, playful nature, capricious nature, or ludus naturae, joke of nature, caprice of nature, recurs in the work. 16th and 17th century European naturalists referred to it when accounting for bizarre forms found in nature. The idea implied not only that nature was endowed with autonomous agency, but that this agency could be playful and, in certain cases, artistically imaginative. In the Museum Metallicum, Aldrovandi articulates all the mineral products of nature's playfulness. Exactly like in Japanese Suseki, he attributes names to categories of stones depending on what they resemble. For instance, he denominates chrysocolosintites, stones that are shaped like gourds. Aldrovandi includes as products of lusus naturae also several pseudo-imaginative stones that modern paleontology would classify as mere fossils. Therefore, he singles out and denominates as many species of stones as there are kinds of fossils. For instance, he proposes to call arengites the stone in which playful nature has impressed the figure of a herring. Although some ancient scholars would interpret these images as traces of extinct living beings, variously explaining the phenomenon, Aristotle, Avicenna, Albert of Saxony, etc., the idea they were actually resulting from the figurative capriciousness of nature persisted well into modernity. Interestingly, among the first scholars who realized that fossils were not icons of living beings, but indexes, that is, imprints of them, many were not only scientists but also artists, Leonardo da Vinci, Girolamo Fracastoro, and Bernard Palissy. On the contrary, at least until the publication of the Herbarium Diluvianum by Johann Jakob Scheuchzer in 1709, and even better until the publication of Histoire des végétaux fossiles by Adolphe Brongniart, 1828-1847, many scholars, including Aldrovandi, believed that nature could paint and sculpt within itself as though endowed with artistic agency. Thus, Aldrovandi devoted a section of his treatise to the lapides cum figuris a natura factis, stones with figures made by nature. Understandably, stones carrying such prodigious effigies would promptly become divination omens. Here the West meets the East again. Aldrovandi quotes a book that had been published in Rome only 5 years earlier, in 1643, by Álvaro Semedo, a Portuguese Jesuit missionary in China, Relazione della Grande Monarchia della Cina, Report on the Great Monarchy of China. Chapter 18 of the first book is entitled Delle Sette della Cina, on the sects of China. First, Semedo compares the religiosity of China with that of Japan. I cinesi sono universalmente poco inclinati alle sette, né in gran parte arrivano agli giapponesi. The Chinese are universally little inclined to sects, and in this domain do not usually match the Japanese. Christianity had been banned from Japan in 1630, that maybe pushed Semedo to such comparison. He then relates the episode quoted by Aldrovandi. Some Taozi philosophers, that is, followers of Lao Tzu's Taoism, preach in the main square of Beijing in 1622. They promise that their prayers will conjure rain, wished for by all citizens after a long drought. However, at the exact time indicated by the prophecy, what falls from the sky is not rain, but strange stones which devastate the city and the countryside. The anti-Taoist zeal of Álvaro Semedo is an evident bias in the story. The enraged crowd beats the fake prophets, preparing the arrival of the truthful Christian preachers. Aldrovandi is not immune from this religious bias. That suggests some more general insights about how human beings identify images in nature. On the one hand, as it was pointed out earlier, certain cognitive features of this process are probably cross-cultural. Page 756 of Aldrovandi's Museum Metallicum contains the reproduction of a prodigious marble showing the effigy of a hermit. The marble that in mid-17th century led the Italian naturalist Ulisse Aldrovandi to recognize a hermit therein can be compared with the Sugata Ishi that in the early 19th century encouraged the Japanese poet Rai Sanyo to identify in it the effigy of a meditating poet. Neurophysiological research suggests that human beings are inclined to recognize face-like or body-like visual patterns in nature, probably because such capacity proved adaptive in the past. Thanks to it, aggressors, dissimulating their presence in the environment through hiding or camouflage, could be unmasked. Furthermore, the idea of associating the image of a stone with that of the immobile meditation of a hermit must have been appealing both in the East and in the West. However, 3 pages later, Aldrovandi reproduces a similar prodigious marble containing a non-human-made image of crucifixion. In this case, the marble might well present observers with a curiously cruciform chromatic, eidetic, and topological pattern. However, observers who identify not only a body, but the crucified body of Jesus do so because hold such iconography in their visual cultural memory. A 14th century Japanese observer would have never recognized a crucifixion in this stone. So, thus far, my point is very simple. As human beings, we are all endowed with the same cognitive mechanism. We are endowed with this cognitive mechanism as a species and not as a culture. This cognitive mechanism pushes us to what specialists call pareidolia, from eidos in Greek, that means figure, image. Although there aren't any images in the environment, we are almost compelled to recognize them and to recognize especially figures of faces and bodies in the environment, for instance in trunks, in bushes, in the forest. This is something that we all share as a species. Nevertheless, this biological, neurophysiological instinct is molded by our visual culture. We can recognize not only a face, but the face of Jesus only if our visual culture includes such iconography. The second essential difference between East and West revolves around the concept of agency. Visual cultures influence the physiological recognition of visual patterns not only at the superficial level of objects and themes, but also at a deeper level of agency, conceptualization, and attribution. Abstract and yet fundamental differences stand out in comparing the Western and the Eastern tradition of imaginative stones. For most Western sources, the prodigy does not consist merely in the fact that some stones resemble certain aspects of reality, be they human beings, animals, or landscapes. Prodigious stones must also contain icons. They must include an intentional effigies that resemble not reality itself, but intentional representations of it produced by artists. That is why painting, and not sculpture, is the Western epitome of art that nature should imitate in its spontaneous playfulness. Western sources usually relate not of stones openly displaying prodigious icons, but of stones that, cut in 2 halves, reveal prodigious icons in their core, as if these art-like effigies were an immemorial secret kept by nature until it was accidentally discovered. The idea that artistic forms must not be created, but rather found in marble, is a topos in the history of Western art, and especially Western sculpture, cherished by Michelangelo and many others. However, in the tradition of imaginative stones, the sculpture's work becomes unnecessary. Nature itself discloses the artistic form that lies in its nucleus. A human procedure, cutting the stone, leads to the discovery, but unintentionally, the unintentional dimension of artistic creation is transferred from nature to humans. Suseki does not usually imply speculation about what force might have inscribed in stones an image that looks like those produced by human agency. In Western sources, on the contrary, the question is central. Identification of prodigious images in nature immediately leads to consider them as signs of a separate dimension which imprints its creativity on the former. Debate among artists and philosophers is particularly controversial as regards the so-called chance images, that is, images that have not been found in nature but have been produced through random human procedures. One of the first accounts of images of such kind is, again, Pliny the Elder. Book 35 of the Natural History recounts an episode in the life of Protogenes, one of the greatest painters in the Western artistic tradition, but also one of the most punctilious. In painting what is considered his most accomplished work, a picture of Lalisus, the artist was perfectly satisfied with every aspect of the painting except for one single element, that is, the foam on the muzzle of a dog represented therein. Its depiction was too perfect to look natural. It seemed artificial. Desperate with painting and repainting the same detail with no avail, Protogenes eventually threw a sponge at the painting, and the irregular stain that the gesture produced painted perfectly spontaneous foam on the muzzle of a dog. The irrational gesture proved so effective that it subsequently turned into a conventional technique for the production of random images. Later on, as Pliny points it out, Nealces used the same expedient to paint foam on a horse's mouth, and of course, many centuries later, Pollock too. The episode is to be categorized as one of the countless artist legends. It nevertheless reveals a key factor of Western aesthetics, characterizing its conception of the arts, at least since the Greeks. On the one hand, the episode suggests that human creativity is intrinsically limited in imitating nature. Certain aspects of nature, like foam on the muzzle of a dog, are so infinitely complex as to appear chaotic. Any intentional, rational procedure of representation tends to reduce that complexity into a simplified simulacrum of it, thus replacing the idea and the image of chaos with those of order. That is the reason for which the only way in which artists can represent the chaos of nature is to let that chaos represent itself. Artists can imitate the Ludus Naturae, the playfulness of nature, by inviting nature itself to play in their own representation of it. As imaginative stones, thus, chance images result from an ontological ideology that constantly tends to single out two separate dimensions in reality. On the one hand, manifestation, on the other hand, an agency that mysteriously works in another dimension but produces effects in the manifested one. No paintings by Protogenes are extant. It is therefore impossible to know how the foam on the muzzle of Lalisus' dog might have looked like. Arguably, Protogenes longed for a visual and artistic effect quite similar to that which Japanese aesthetics denominates, but very rarely defines, as wabi-sabi. In order for the pictorial representation of foam to look authentic, it should not possess the characteristics of finitude, perfection, and conclusiveness that Protogenes so skillfully used to achieve in his works, so as to perfectly represent the infinite and unfathomable complexity of nature. Imperfection had to be let in the painting. A perfect depiction of nature should have contained imperfection. Yet the pictorial skills of Protagonist's meticulousness were unable to produce it. The random gesture of throwing a sponge at the painting found a natural solution to the impasse through the intervention of Natura Ludens, playful nature. The wabi-sabi visual effect produced by Protagonist's sponge must have been quite similar to the infinitely multifarious patterns of shapes, colors, and textures that characterize Japanese raku pottery. The production of raku pottery, too, indeed, stems from an irreducibly complex interplay between the initiative of the potter and nature, represented by one of its most uncontrollable elements, that is, fire. It was exactly this interplay that fascinated Western potters when Japanese anagama kilns were first introduced in Europe. That happened through labyrinthine paths. One of the Western authors that most popularized Japanese aesthetics in Europe between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, and particularly after it became extremely fashionable at the 1900 Paris Exposition Universelle, was Lafcadio Hearn, also known as Koizumi Yakumo. It was exactly through reading Hearn's books that Bernard Leach, currently considered as the father of British studio pottery, became interested in Japan, traveled to the country, and after attending a raku pottery party about 1911, undertook studying this art under Urano Shigekichi, also known as Kenzen VI in the tradition of Kyoto potter Ogata Kensan. So, unlike modern Western pottery kilns, anagama kilns are fueled with firewood, which produces not only the heat that is necessary for pottery, but also fly ash and volatile salts. The natural ash glaze that is distinctive of raku pottery aesthetics results from the unpredictably complex interplay between flame, ash, and the minerals of the clay body in anagama kilns. Since this body will receive a different glaze depending on its position in the kiln and in relation to other clay bodies, loading the anagama is one of the most difficult tasks in raku pottery. Its wabi-sabi aesthetics stem from the infinite variables of the encounter between human choice and the uncontrollable agency of natural elements. So what is my point here? My point here that once again we see a similarity between the aesthetics of the West and the aesthetics of the East. And this similarity is once again linked to a cognitive, innate drive of the human species, which is that to attribute an agency, an anthropomorphic agency, to non-human elements in the environment. When we throw a sponge at a painting, like Protagonist did when he was unable to complete his painting, we believe that there is a mysterious force that the Greeks would call chance, completing the painting instead of the painter. But the same instinct, the same cognitive endowment of the species pushes Japanese potters to believe that the final pottery will be the result of a cooperation between human beings and nature, between the way in which the potter situates the clay bodies in the anagama kilns and the completely uncontrollable way in which fire will dance among these clay bodies. So this is again a common aesthetic feature but there is also, once again, the necessity to differentiate. To resume, I will quote another of my sources, Dio Chrysostom, who wrote a very famous treatise in Western philosophy called Peritiuches Protos Logos, the first discourse on fortune. It is a work entirely devoted to chance, to fortune, to the differences between chance and fortune. Dio Chrysostom relates similar episodes to that related by Pliny the Elder, but attributes it to another mythical painter of antiquity, Roman Greco antiquity, Apelles. Apelles was also unable to complete his painting because the blood upon the froth of a horse he was depicting, it was not natural enough, and so he threw himself a sponge at the painting, and the sponge completed the painting for Apelles. And Dio Chrysostom concludes, and at the side Apelles was delighted by what fortune had accomplished in his moment of despair, and finished his painting, not through his art, but through the aid of fortune. Now, what is the difference here between the East and the West in the way chance is let into the creation of the work of art? Well, my point here is that the Western artist throws the sponge exactly like the boxer does. The boxer throws the sponge when he's defeated. And in all these stories in the Western tradition, nature is invited into the creation of the work of art as a rival of the artist. The artist cannot complete the work of art, so nature must come in. The artist is defeated, throws the sponge, the nature comes in, chance comes in and completes the painting. In the Eastern aesthetics, the idea of the cooperation between the artist and nature is not the idea of a rivalry, but it's the idea of sort of a symbiosis, sort of a dance, a cooperation with no hierarchical competition. Now, one of the texts that most distinctively indicates this Western attitude, this attitude in Western aesthetics, is a passage in Cicero's De Divinatione, a book entirely devoted on divination. And at some stage, Cicero asks, I'm going to read this quotation because it's absolutely fundamental for our discourse. But what, you ask Carneades, why these things so happen, or by what rules they may be understood? I confess that I do not know, but they do so fall out, I assert, that you yourself see. Mere accidents, you say. Now, really, is that so? Can anything be an accident which bears upon itself every mark of truth? 4 dice are cast. I don't know if dice are popular in Japan, but I guess they are. And I don't know what is the translation for dice, but 4 dice are cast and a Venus throw results. Now the Venus throw is the throw that results when you throw 2 or 3 or 4 dice and all the dice show a 6 on the top surface. This is the Venus throw. That is chance. But do you think it would be a chance too if in 100 casts you made 100 Venus throws? It is possible for paints flung at random on a canvas to form the outlines of a face. But do you imagine that an accidental scattering of pigments could produce the beautiful portrait of Venus of Cos? Suppose that a hawk should form the letter A on the ground with its snout. The hawk is an animal, it's a cinghiale, I don't know how you say in Japanese. Suppose that a hawk should form the letter A on the ground with its snout. Is that a reason for believing that it would write out Ennius's poem, the Andromache? Carneades used to have a story that once in the Chian quarries, when a stone was split open, the same episode related by Pliny, there appeared the head of the infant god Pan. I grant that the figure may have borne some resemblance to the god, but assuredly the resemblance was not such that you could ascribe the work to a Scopas. For, Cicero concludes, it is undeniably true that no perfect imitation of a thing was ever made by chance. Cicero is essentially a rationalist. He's writing about the Roman haruspices, those who claim to see the future in science, the flying of birds or the intestines of animals. And he's saying, okay, nature sometimes can produce images. Chance sometimes can produce images. But these images will be never as perfect as images produced by human intentionality, by artists' intentionality. So Cicero is strongly affirming the superiority of artists over nature. Nature can sometimes imitate artists, but artists can always and much better imitate nature. Now, this attitude of hierarchical superiority of the artist over nature has characterized, I believe, almost the entire history of Western art until the Impressionists. There is a very famous quote attributed to Cézanne. The quote says, "The landscape thinks itself in me, and I am its consciousness." With Cézanne and the Impressionists, for the first time probably in the history of Western art, the artist does not think of him or herself as someone superior to nature, but as someone who is the humble consciousness of nature. It is an instrument of nature through which nature himself must show itself and represent itself. Now, probably in no other work is the French artist Cézanne's vocation to become the consciousness of nature as evident as in the over 60 oil paintings in which he obsessively depicted Mont Sainte-Victoire, a limestone mountain ridge in the south of France. This mountain was so deep an element in Cézanne's existential landscape that he did not want to merely represent it as a mountain, as the abstract type of a mountain. He strived to depict it as the mountain, as a living being whose uniqueness consisted in continuously escaping a pictorial definition, in perennially fluctuating as counterpart of the artist's consciousness. Now, there is controversy among art historians about the extent to which Cézanne was influenced, as his contemporary Impressionists Manet, Pissarro, and Van Gogh certainly were, by Japanese art. There is plenty of historical evidence, though, that Cézanne's idea of becoming the pictorial consciousness of the quintessential mountain of his native landscape came to him after admiring Hokusai's 36 views of Mount Fuji. Indeed, well before that, the 1900 Paris Universal Exhibition made Japanese aesthetics popular in Europe, the Impressionists were the first representative of the so-called Japonism. Through visual cross-fertilization with Japanese prints, they were confirmed not only in their novel way of painting, but also and above all in their revolutionary way of seeing nature and interpreting their relation with it. Cézanne's encounter with Hokusai led him to affirm the symbiosis between painter and landscape in the creation of the artwork. And now I conclude, after this long going back and forth between Europe and Japan. So the neurophysiology of vision and cognition shapes the way in which human beings visually read the environment. A biological instinct, probably selected as adaptive through evolution, pushes them to recognize coherent shapes in chaotic visual patterns and to impute the creation of these shapes to an anthropomorphic agency. In the West as in the East, in Italy as in Japan, human beings have identified faces, bodies, and landscapes in the bizarre chromatic, eidetic, and topologic configurations of stones, clouds, and other natural elements, as though invisible painters and sculptors had depicted the former in the latter. However, culture-specific visual ideologies immediately and deeply mold such cross-cultural instinct of pattern recognition and agency attribution. Giants and mythical monsters are seen in clouds in the West as in the East. Both the Italian 17th century naturalist and the Japanese 17th century painter identify figures of animals and plants in stones. Yet, the ways in which they articulate the semantics of visual recognition, identify its icons, determine its agency, and categorize it in relation to an ontological framework diverge profoundly according to such exquisitely paths of differentiation that only the study of culture together with that of nature can account for. Thank you very much for your patience.